Would someone kindly escort this staggering intellect out of my ICU before his sheer incompetence forces me to call security to protect my sterile environment?
Get this illiterate, garbage-pushing ape out of my ICU before I have him arrested for contaminating my sterile field. The words ricochet off the pristine, glass-walled corridors of the surgical ward. Dr. Sterling Vance's voice is a whip cracking through the heavy, terrified silence of the intensive care unit. He stands over the failing body of the city's most important patient, his face flushed with panicked rage, pointing a trembling, gloved finger at the man holding a mop. The man in the faded blue janitor's uniform does not flinch. He does not drop his gaze. He simply stands there, his cracked, calloused hands resting lightly on the aluminum handle of his mop. His breathing is steady. A small leather-bound notebook rests in his breast pocket. He watches the monitors tracking the dying woman's erratic heartbeat, his eyes tracking the jagged green lines with a calm, analytical precision that no one in the room understands. He doesn't defend himself. He does not shout back. He simply commits the exact phrasing of the insult, the precise time on the wall clock, 11:14 p.m., and the exact dosage of the intravenous drip to memory. You are watching a man being stripped of his humanity in front of a dozen silent witnesses. But what the furious chief of surgery doesn't know, what the snickering security guards approaching with handcuffs don't know, is that the man pushing the mop is the only person on the continent who knows why the mayor's wife is dying. And in exactly 72 hours, Dr. Sterling Vance's illustrious career will be reduced to ash. A multi-million-dollar medical empire will be brought to its knees, and the most powerful men in the city will be begging this janitor for forgiveness. But to understand how an invisible man dismantled a fortress of arrogance, you need to go back to the beginning. The world before the sirens, before the courtroom gavels, and before the ultimate vindication began the way every day began for Elias. It began in the quiet, pre-dawn dark of a cramped, third-floor walk-up on the forgotten south side of the city. At 4 a.m., the air in the apartment was cold, carrying the faint, metallic scent of the nearby rail yard and the sharp tang of the jasmine tea Elias brewed on a single electric burner. The sensory reality of Elias's life was built on hard surfaces and worn edges. He sat at a small, scarred wooden table, his large hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. The hands told a story the world rarely bothered to read. They were dark, deeply lined, the knuckles thickened by years of harsh chemical floor cleaners, the cuticles permanently stained with the faint, ghostly residue of industrial ammonia, but the fingers themselves were exceptionally long, impossibly dexterous, and possessed a quiet, deliberate grace. He wore his uniform, a faded, shapeless navy blue jumpsuit that smelled perpetually of lemon disinfectant and bleach. It was the armor of the unseen. It was a garment designed to make the wearer blend into the background, to become an appliance rather than a human being. On his feet were a pair of second-hand, steel-toed work shoes, the leather scuffed dull, the laces frayed. Before he left for the hospital, Elias engaged in his daily ritual. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook. It was filled with microscopic, meticulously organized handwriting, equations, chemical structures, diagnostic algorithms, and observations written in 3 different languages. He ran his thumb over the embossed cover, then reached up to touch the small silver pendant hanging beneath his collar. The pendant had belonged to Mama Odette. Even now, 30 years after she had passed, her voice was the architecture of his mind. She had been a woman of unyielding spine and bottomless grace, a woman who scrubbed the floors of wealthy estates so her son could read books under the dim glow of street lamps. Whenever the indignities of the world threatened to erode Elias's spirit, her voice echoed in the chambers of his memory, anchoring him to the earth. Dignity isn't a coat they can hand you, Elias. And it isn't a coat they can strip off, she used to say, her hands smelling of cocoa butter and harsh lye soap. It is the bone you are built on. Let them look at you and see what they want. You know who you are in the dark. He closed the notebook, tucked it safely back against his chest, and walked out into the biting morning air. Elias worked at the St. Jude's Pinnacle Pavilion. It was not merely a hospital. It was an exclusive sanctuary for the global elite, a sprawling campus of glass, titanium, and imported Italian marble. The Pinnacle Pavilion did not cater to the common sick. It catered to sick royalty, ailing tech billionaires, and politicians whose insurance policies resembled the gross domestic product of small island nations. The sensory contrast between Elias and the environment he cleaned was jarring, a deliberate masterpiece of systemic exclusion. The lobby was bathed in golden, ambient light, cascading from geometric chandeliers. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, a shine Elias maintained. The air smelled vaguely of eucalyptus, sanitized luxury, and old money. The ambient sound was the hushed, expensive hum of soft-soled designer shoes and the gentle clinking of ice in crystal water glasses from the VIP waiting lounge. Into this world of gleaming privilege walked Elias, pushing a yellow plastic cart with a squeaky right wheel, a ghost haunting a palace. The hierarchy of the pavilion was rigid, and at the absolute apex of this food chain was Dr. Sterling Vance, the chief of surgery and head of diagnostic medicine. Vance was a man constructed entirely of surface markers. He wore custom-tailored, Tom Ford suits beneath his perfectly starched, blindingly white lab coat. A platinum Patek Philippe watch rested heavily on his wrist, a beacon of his status. His hair was silver, his jawline sharp, his demeanor dripping with the intoxicating arrogance of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. Sterling Vance did not see Elias. He did not merely ignore him. He actively looked through him, the way one looks through a pane of glass to see the scenery outside. The first subtle sign of the rot beneath the pavilion's gleaming surface happened on a Tuesday. Elias was buffing the marble near the VIP elevators when Vance and his entourage of terrified residents swept through. Vance was explaining a complex hepatic portal vein bypass, his voice booming with theatrical authority. Without looking, Vance stepped directly into Elias's path, forcing the older black man to step back sharply, nearly twisting his ankle to avoid a collision. Vance didn't pause. He didn't apologize. He merely flicked his wrist, irritated that the air had momentarily displaced his stride. A young resident in the back of the pack snickered. Elias stopped the buffer. He watched Vance step into the elevator. He did not scowl. He did not sigh. He simply noted the slight tremor in Vance's left hand, the faint smell of stale bourbon masked heavily by expensive peppermint breath spray, and the pronounced asymmetrical swelling in the patient file Vance had been carelessly waving around. Elias knew what the swelling meant. Vance apparently did not. But Elias's true test, the crucible that would expose the fragile, hollow core of the pavilion, began when Mayor Thomas Sterling's wife, Eleanor, was admitted to the VIP intensive care suite. Eleanor was 42, vibrant, and suddenly, inexplicably, dying. It started with a persistent numbness in her extremities, dismissed by her private concierge doctors as stress. Within 2 weeks, it escalated to agonizing abdominal pain, sudden, terrifying bouts of blindness, and a rapidly cascading failure of her kidneys. She was transferred to St. Jude's under the veil of night, flanked by private security and the mayor's panicked political fixers. The pavilion's top diagnostic team, led by Dr. Vance, threw every piece of million-dollar technology at her. They ran full-body MRIs, complex autoimmune panels, heavy metal screens, and rare infectious disease cultures. Everything came back negative. By day 4, Eleanor was slipping into a coma. The machines in her room beeped with a frantic, rhythmic terror. The fluorescent lights of the ICU corridor reflected off the polished floors, casting long, stark shadows. Elias was assigned to clean the outer observation deck of the VIP suite. The glass walls allowed him a perfect, unobstructed view of the chaos inside. He pushed his mop methodically, the wet cotton sliding over the cold tile with a soft, rhythmic shh, shh, shh. Through the glass, he watched Vance pacing furiously, barking orders at the nurses. He watched them hang bags of high-dose corticosteroids, followed by broad-spectrum intravenous antibiotics. He watched them hook her to a continuous renal replacement therapy machine, the thick plastic tubes pulsing with her dark, sluggish blood. And then, Elias saw it. It was a minor detail, a fleeting physiological tell that millions of dollars of AI-driven diagnostic software had missed. When the nurse adjusted Eleanor's neckline, Elias caught a glimpse of her fingernails. They were marked with faint, transverse white lines, Mises lines. He then looked at her monitor. He noted the specific, bizarre uncoupling of her heart rate from her blood pressure, bradycardia paired with severe hypertension. He remembered the faint smell of bitter almonds he had noticed lingering on her discarded clothes bag in the utility room 2 days prior. Elias stopped mopping. The pieces of a complex, terrifying puzzle snapped together in his mind with mathematical perfection. It wasn't an autoimmune cascade. It wasn't a rare tropical parasite. It was a highly specific, synthetic organophosphate compound, likely combined with a sublethal, cumulative dosing of thallium, a designer poison. Someone was slowly, methodically murdering the mayor's wife, and the massive doses of corticosteroids Vance was pumping into her veins were actually accelerating the binding of the neurotoxin to her cellular receptors. Vance was actively killing her. Elias knew the precise chemical antidote required. He knew the exact titration schedule. He knew it because in a life that St. Jude's Pavilion had refused to acknowledge, he had written the definitive, globally recognized textbook on synthetic neurotoxins. But in this hallway, in this uniform, he was just a mop. Elias approached the nurse's station outside the glass. The station was temporarily empty. The staff was clustered inside the room around the crashing patient. On the counter lay Eleanor's sprawling, digitized medical chart, temporarily left open on an iPad. Beside it was a blank prescription pad. Elias put his mop down. His heart beat a slow, steady rhythm. He took out his pen, a cheap plastic ballpoint, and wrote a single, highly specific sentence on the pad, placing it directly over the iPad screen. Discontinue corticosteroids immediately. Thallium/organophosphate toxicity suspected. Administer Prussian blue, 3 grams TID, and atropine sulfate. Check for heavy metal hair follicle saturation. He didn't sign it. He simply left it where Vance would have to see it the moment he stepped out. He picked up his mop and turned to leave. He didn't make it 5 steps. The heavy glass door of the ICU swung open with violent force, shattering the quiet hum of the corridor. Dr. Vance stormed out, his face a mask of exhausted fury, screaming at a resident over his shoulder. He marched to the nurse's station, slammed his clipboard down, and saw the note. Vance picked up the small piece of paper. He read it. For a fraction of a second, confusion flashed across his features, followed by a sudden, terrifying realization of his own utter failure. But that realization immediately curdled into defensive, explosive rage. He looked up, his eyes scanning the empty corridor until they locked onto the back of the blue uniform pushing the yellow cart. "Hey!" Vance roared. The sound echoed down the long, pristine hallway, freezing everyone in their tracks. Nurses rushed to the doorway. Residents stopped typing. 2 large security guards at the end of the hall turned on their heels. Elias stopped. He turned slowly, his face an impenetrable mask of calm. Vance marched toward him, closing the distance with aggressive, predatory strides. He thrust the piece of paper into Elias's face. So close, Elias could smell the sharp tang of the doctor's fear masquerading as anger. "Did you write this?" Vance hissed, his voice vibrating with venom. "Did you touch my patient's station?" Elias looked at the paper, then directly into Vance's flushed, sweating face. "The corticosteroids are accelerating the neuromuscular blockade, doctor. She requires immediate heavy metal chelation." The room inhaled collectively. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. A janitor had just given a diagnostic directive to the chief of surgery. Vance's face contorted into something ugly and primal. The veneer of the elite, sophisticated physician vanished. replaced by the ugly, raw bigotry of a man who believed his zip code and skin color made him a god. Get this illiterate, garbage-pushing ape out of my ICU before I have him arrested for contaminating my sterile field, Vance screamed, his voice cracking. He didn't just want Elias gone, he wanted him destroyed. He wanted to reestablish the hierarchy that this black man in a cheap uniform had just casually dismantled. You mop floors! Vance bellowed, stepping closer, attempting to physically intimidate the taller, older man. You clean up the vomit and the shit! You do not look at charts. You do not speak to me. You are nothing but a liability, a walking infection risk, security. Bystander complicity is a quiet, devastating disease. It spreads through silence. Elias looked around the corridor. Dr. Peterson, a senior resident who had secretly doubted Vance's protocol for days, suddenly found his shoes fascinating, looking away. Nurse Higgins, who had shared a quiet smile with Elias over coffee just yesterday, stepped back into the shadows of the doorway, pulling out her phone and subtly beginning to record, turning a man's humiliation into content. A group of wealthy VIP visitors at the end of the hall pointed and whispered, their faces tight with aristocratic disgust. They all watched. No one spoke. No one intervened. Elias did not react emotionally. The internal code he had built over decades held firm. He did not raise his hands. He did not raise his voice. He stood perfectly still, his posture erect, his breathing slow and measured. His dignity was an impenetrable fortress. While Vance unraveled, spitting and red-faced, Elias remained an ocean of absolute, terrifying calm. You are making a fatal pharmacological error, Dr. Vance, Elias said. His voice was low, rich, and steady, cutting through the hysteria like a scalpel through soft tissue. Shut up! Shut your mouth! Vance shrieked, losing whatever shred of professional composure he had left. Take him down! I want him charged with trespassing and tampering with medical records, now! The two security guards, eager to please the hospital's golden goose, lunged forward. One grabbed Elias's shoulder roughly, twisting his arm behind his back with unnecessary force. The other slapped heavy metal handcuffs onto his wrists. The cold steel clicked loudly, a harsh mechanical sound echoing in the luxury corridor. As they jerked him backward, Elias did not struggle. He simply turned his head and locked eyes with a single person in the crowd. Nurse Clara Dawson. Clara was a 20-year veteran of the ICU, a black woman who had survived the politics of St. Jude's by keeping her head down and doing her job flawlessly. She was the only person in the room who wasn't looking at Elias with pity or contempt. She was looking at the note in Vance's hand, and then she looked at the monitors inside the room. She had seen the maze lines too, but hadn't known what they meant. Now, a horrifying clarity washed over her face. Elias held her gaze for a single, heavy second. He gave her a microscopic nod. Look at the labs. As the guards dragged him away, his worn shoes squeaking in protest against the marble he had just polished, Elias went into the documentation protocol he had utilized his entire life. His phone, safely in his pocket, had been recording audio since the moment he saw the chart. He mentally logged the time, 11:22 p.m. He logged the names of the two guards. He logged the exact, verbatim slurs Vance had hurled at him. They dragged him down to the basement security holding cell, a damp, concrete room far away from the chandeliers and eucalyptus air. They shoved him onto a metal bench. Sit there and keep your mouth shut, mop boy, the lead guard sneered, locking the heavy steel door behind him. Elias sat. The metal bar of the bench dug into his spine. The cold concrete chilled his legs, but he did not panic. He simply waited. He knew the biology of the poison. He knew exactly how much time Eleanor Sterling had left. 42 minutes. Upstairs, the world was collapsing. 30 minutes after Elias was dragged away, the alarms in Eleanor's room changed from a frantic, rhythmic warning to a solid, continuous scream of sheer panic. Code blue. VIPICU. Code blue. Eleanor was seizing violently, her body arching off the bed. Her heart rate plummeted into the 30s. Her blood pressure was bottoming out. The toxic load of the corticosteroids had finally broken down her last neurological defenses. Vance was paralyzed. The arrogant god of the pavilion stood frozen at the foot of the bed, the defibrillator paddles hanging uselessly in his hands. He had no idea what to do. His protocol had failed. His ego was writing a death certificate for the most high-profile patient in the state. Push epi! Push another amp of bicarb! He finally stammered, his voice devoid of authority, thick with blind panic. It's not working, a resident screamed over the alarm. She's in V-fib. Outside the glass doors, the elevator chimed. The heavy doors parted, and Mayor Thomas Sterling burst out, flanked by 3 enormous plainclothes detectives and a man in a sharp, understated gray suit carrying a brushed aluminum briefcase. The man in the gray suit was Dr. Eris Thorne, the world's foremost authority on biochemical warfare and exotic toxicology, flown in from Geneva on a private jet chartered by the Department of Defense at the mayor's desperate request. The mayor pushed through the crowd of terrified staff and slammed his hands against the glass, watching his wife die. "What the hell is happening, Vance?" he roared through the intercom. Vance looked up, pale, terrified. "Mayor, her autoimmune system is undergoing a catastrophic failure. We are doing everything." "Step aside, Dr. Vance," commanded Dr. Eris Thorne, striding into the room. He didn't look at Vance. He went straight to the monitors. His eyes scanned the data. His brow furrowed. He looked at Eleanor's fingernails. He sniffed the air near her mouth. "Who ordered massive doses of corticosteroids?" Dr. Thorne asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I did," Vance said defensively. "It's standard protocol for—" "You're killing her," Thorne said flatly. "This isn't autoimmune. This is synthetic organophosphate poisoning combined with thallium. The steroids are acting as a catalyst." Vance's jaw dropped. The exact words, the exact diagnosis. "We need Prussian blue and atropine, massive doses immediately." Thorne barked at the paralyzed nursing staff. Nobody moved. The medication wasn't standard floor stock. It would take 20 minutes to get from the central pharmacy, and Eleanor had less than 3. Suddenly, the door swung open again. Nurse Clara Dawson stood there. She was breathing hard, sweating, her scrubs rumpled. In her hands, she held 2 large, specialized glass vials of medication and a small, worn leather notebook. She walked directly past Vance, ignoring him completely, and handed the vials to Dr. Thorne. "Prussian blue and atropine, doctor. I pulled them from the hazmat overflow lockbox." Thorne looked at the nurse, surprised. "How did you know to pull these?" Clara didn't look at Vance. She looked directly at the mayor. "I didn't know, sir. He did." She handed the small leather notebook to Dr. Thorne. Thorne opened it. His eyes widened. He recognized the handwriting immediately. He recognized the complex, brilliant, proprietary chemical equations that only one man in the world used. He flipped to the front page and saw the name embossed on the inside cover. "Doctor." Thorne slowly lowered the notebook. He looked at Clara, his face a mask of absolute shock. "Where did you get this?" "It belongs to the janitor, sir," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly but laced with iron defiance. The one Dr. Vance just had arrested and handcuffed in the basement for trying to tell him the diagnosis. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical pumping of the ventilator, keeping Eleanor alive as the antidote began to course through her veins. The mayor turned slowly. He looked at Vance. The color had completely drained from Vance's face. He looked like a corpse. "You had him arrested?" the mayor whispered, the quietness of his voice far more terrifying than his earlier shouting. He was a sweeper, Tom," Vance stammered, stepping backward, his hands shaking. "He was pushing a mop. He was contaminating the field. I couldn't possibly—" "Where is he?" Dr. Thorne demanded, his voice echoing with the authority of an angry god. 10 minutes later, the heavy steel door of the basement security cell swung open. The 2 security guards were standing outside, looking pale and terrified, flanked by the mayor's heavily armed detectives. Elias sat on the metal bench. He had not moved. He looked up calmly as the entourage entered the cramped, damp room. Dr. Eris Thorne stepped into the cell. The brilliant, wealthy, globally renowned toxicologist stopped in front of the man in the blue janitor's uniform. Slowly, deliberately, Dr. Thorne bowed his head in a gesture of profound, undeniable respect. "Dr. Carter," Thorne said softly, "it is an honor to finally meet you in person. I have taught from your textbooks for 15 years. The 2 security guards physically stumbled backward. The air punched from their lungs. The lead guard looked at the handcuffs on Elias's wrists, realizing with mounting, nauseating horror what he had done. The mayor stepped forward, his eyes red, his hands trembling. "Dr. Carter, I don't understand." Elias stood up. He did not ask them to remove the handcuffs. He forced them to look at him exactly as he was. 12 years ago, Elias said, his voice echoing in the cold concrete room, my home country collapsed into civil war. I was the chief of diagnostic toxicology at the National University. When the regime fell, my laboratory was burned. My credentials, my records, my life's work, erased. He looked directly at the mayor. When I brought my daughter to this country to save her life, Your medical boards told me my expertise was unverified. They told me I would have to start over, to spend a decade proving what I already knew. My daughter needed food. She needed a safe roof. So I took the job that paid immediately. He looked down at his faded uniform. I took the mop. The mayor turned slowly to the guards. Take those cuffs off him, now. The guard's hands shook so badly he dropped the key twice before finally unlocking the heavy steel bracelets. Elias rubbed his wrists slowly, the physical sensation of the cold metal lingering, a phantom reminder of the indignity. Bring him upstairs, the mayor commanded softly. When Elias stepped off the VIP elevator, the corridor was unrecognizable. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying stillness. The wealthy bystanders who had pointed and sneered were gone. The complicit residents stood with their backs pressed against the walls, heads down, refusing to make eye contact. Dr. Sterling Vance stood in the center of the hallway. He was surrounded by hospital administrators, lawyers in expensive suits, and the mayor's security detail. Vance looked like a man standing on the gallows, watching the lever being pulled. His custom suit suddenly looked absurd, a costume worn by a frightened child. Elias walked slowly down the marble floor. He didn't rush. He didn't swagger. Every step was measured, grounded in the quiet, absolute authority his mother had promised him. He stopped 3 feet from Vance. Vance opened his mouth, trying to salvage the unsalvageable. Dr. Carter, it was a profound misunderstanding. Protocol dictates that unauthorized personnel. Elias held up a single hand. The gesture was so gentle, yet so heavy with moral gravity, that Vance's mouth snapped shut instantly. Elias looked at the man who had dehumanized him. He didn't yell. He didn't sneer. His voice was calm, a deep, resonant bell tolling the end of an era. You walked into my hospital wing, Elias began, his voice carrying down the long corridor, echoing off the glass and crystal. You utilized the diagnostic algorithms I wrote to run your lab tests. You depended on the biochemical foundations I discovered to structure your intensive care unit. You benefited from the silence and the labor I gave to keep your floors shining and your reflections clear. Elias took one step closer. Vance physically shrank back. And when you saw a black man standing in your pristine hallway holding a mop, Elias continued, his words slicing through the air with devastating surgical precision. The first thing you did was assume I was unlettered. You assumed I was a contagion. You didn't look at the data. You looked at my skin. You looked at my clothes. And you chose your own fragile ego over the life of a dying woman. Vance was trembling violently now. The color had drained so completely from his face that the veins on his temples stood out in a stark, blue relief. I was trying to save her, he whispered, a pathetic, broken defense. No, Elias said, the finality in his voice ringing like a gavel strike. I didn't contaminate your sterile field, Dr. Vance. You contaminated your own oath. Elias turned away from him, completely dismissing the man from his existence. He looked at Nurse Clara Dawson, who was standing by the door, tears streaming silently down her face. Thank you, Nurse Dawson, Elias said gently. You have excellent clinical instincts. He then looked at the mayor. Your wife is stabilizing. The heavy metals are collating. She will need extensive physical therapy, but the neurological damage is not permanent. My notebook contains the exact titration schedule for the next 14 days. Elias turned and began to walk toward the elevator. Dr. Carter, please, the mayor called out, desperation in his voice. We can reinstate you. We can offer you the chief of diagnostics chair, anything. Elias stopped. He looked over his shoulder at the sprawling, opulent, corrupt machinery of St. Jude's Pinnacle Pavilion. He looked at the administrators furiously texting their PR teams, calculating the fallout. I don't work for institutions that require a title to recognize a human being, Elias said quietly. Keep your chair, Mr. Mayor. He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. The institutional reckoning that followed was swift, brutal, and utterly comprehensive. It did not merely punish the bad actor, it dismantled the enabling structure. Within 48 hours, Dr. Sterling Vance was not just fired. He was escorted off the premises by federal marshals. The audio recording Elias had captured on his phone, detailing Vance's racist slurs and his refusal to review life-saving medical data, was subpoenaed by the state medical board. Vance's medical license was permanently revoked for gross negligence and willful malpractice. The ripple consequences hit the pavilion like a tsunami. The mayor's office filed a $42 million civil suit against the hospital's parent company. The board of directors was entirely purged. 12 new institutional policies were mandated by the state, completely restructuring how auxiliary and support staff were integrated into patient care reporting. The 2 security guards who had assaulted Elias were terminated and charged with false imprisonment and battery. And hidden in the fine print of the legal settlement structured by the mayor's aggressive legal team was a massive, non-disclosed 8-figure financial transfer made directly to a newly established trust. 3 months later, the air was warm, smelling of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Elias sat on the wide wooden porch of a beautiful, modest home on the outskirts of the city. He wore a simple linen shirt and comfortable, soft-soled shoes. His hands rested on the arms of a rocking chair, still calloused, but no longer stained with industrial bleach. Next to him sat his daughter, Maya. She was 19, bright-eyed, her lap covered in heavy medical textbooks. She was in her first year of pre-med at the state's most prestigious university, her tuition paid in full, forever, by the trust. Maya looked up from her book, her brow furrowed at a complex biochemical equation. "Dad, I don't understand how the thallium bypasses the cellular defense mechanism without triggering an immediate cytokine storm." Elias smiled. It was a genuine, deep smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He leaned over, pointing a long, graceful finger at the diagram on the page. "Because, my love," Elias explained softly, "the poison doesn't attack the door. It disguises itself as the key. It waits for the body to invite it in." He leaned back, looking out over the green lawn, the trauma of the hospital fading into the distance. He reached up and touched the silver pendant resting against his chest. Mama Odette had been right. They couldn't take the coat because the dignity was in the bone. We watch stories like this, and we cheer for the downfall of the villain. We love seeing arrogance humiliated and power brought to its knees. But what really made Elias Carter's story matter wasn't the brilliant medical twist, and it wasn't the crushing financial ruin of a corrupt doctor. It was the terrifying reality of the silence in that hallway. When Sterling Vance screamed those dehumanizing insults, a dozen educated, wealthy, powerful people stood by and watched. They looked at their phones. They looked at their shoes. They let a brilliant man be placed in metal handcuffs because challenging the system was too uncomfortable. So I have to ask you, if you were standing in that hallway, wearing those scrubs, holding that chart, what would you have done? Would you have been the one to look away? Or would you have been Clara Dawson, risking your entire livelihood because you refused to let the truth be buried in a basement cell? We all think we'd be the hero, but complicity doesn't usually look like cheering for the villain. It looks like quiet, polite silence. If you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who has been overlooked, underestimated, or treated like they are invisible because of the uniform they wear or the space they occupy, share this story with them. Subscribe to this channel because we aren't just telling stories here. We are building a continuous archive of what happens when ordinary people refuse to let the powerful rewrite reality. We are documenting the blueprint of justice because true worth doesn't need a custom suit, a corner office, or the validation of an arrogant system. It just needs the quiet, unbreakable courage to know exactly who you are in the dark. Remember that. It just needs the quiet, unbreakable courage to know exactly who you are in the dark. Remember that.
It just needs the quiet, unbreakable courage to know exactly who you are in the dark. Remember that.